Very welcome to this first panel of two this afternoon and evening. These discussions have been, as President Ernst Osterkamp just said, being conceived by Debates on Europe, organized or a cooperation not randomly, I think, to German institutions, especially back at the beginning of or around 2012, when these events started. There were German institutions, more than in the rest of Europe, that saw the need for a cooperation that goes beyond borders and also goes beyond the borders of the current European Union. So it's, I don't think, an accident that it's the S. Fischer Stiftung in Berlin and die Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung in Darmstadt that are behind this series of events. As Ernst Osterkamp said, the first event was held in Budapest 2012. They have always been hosted and held in places where something is at stake, where the future is being negotiated in one way or the other, politically, socially, culturally, where the very idea of Europe is being formed. A few years ago, which Ernst Osterkamp also mentioned, we, Debates on Europe, it was just after the annexation of the illegal annexation of Crimea, we visited Kharkiv, a city that already then incorporated the resolve of the Ukrainian nation, and a city which is today being shelled by Russian invaders. Ingo Schulze, member of the Academy and present here today, was also present in Kharkiv, and he wrote movingly about these days of getting to know perspectives and experiences that are otherwise not so acutely present in the public spheres of Germany or France or elsewhere. And he wrote about how such encounters are bound to change the way one sees the world. For those interested, and most of you know it, Ingo Schulze's account of the Debates on Europe event in Kharkiv is a part of his latest book, a book of essays that has just been published. Such encounters between international experts, writers, and intellectuals with their local peers and colleagues have also taken place in Minsk, in St. Petersburg, as Osterkamp mentioned, in Narva in the north, or in Skopje and Athens in the south, or in Sarajevo, just to mention another European focal point, and today we're here in Dresden. All these events have addressed some of the most pressing issues on the European agenda, and this is what we will do today as well. Climate crisis, inflation crisis, health crisis, debt crisis, energy crisis, refugee crisis, demography crisis, food crisis, the crisis of representative democracy, military war. Do we perhaps have a crisis or two too much to handle? Perhaps. But perhaps, and that's on a hopeful stance, perhaps it's actually the political project Europe, das politische Gebilde Europa, or to be more exact, the European Union, that will be able to deal with all these challenges. This afternoon and this evening will show if that, from my side, is just wishful thinking. Here to discuss the current situation are some of the people I rely most on in guiding me through these difficult times, whether in private talks or in what they say and write in the public sphere. We will listen to a truly international constellation, including voices from Poland, Germany, Ukraine, France, the UK. It could not be much more European. I will now give the floor to the moderator of the first of today's discussions. In between the discussions, there will be a short break, and the next one will start at 8 o'clock. I say this already now. But the moderator of this first discussion is Eric Maurice, a French national Eric Maurice has for decades been part of numerous pan-European media endeavors, such as Courrier International, Presse Europe, the EU Observer. Currently, he is the chair of the Brussels office of Fondation Robert Schuman. Please, Eric, the word is yours.
Thank you, So, thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you to the German Academy, to the S. Fischer Stiftung for inviting us, organizing these two panels, and thank you for being here in this room with us. I will give you a short introduction, but no scoop. You all know that war is back in Europe. Of course, it had been back in Europe already in former Yugoslavia, in Georgia, already in Ukraine in 2014. But now what we witness is what military calls the high-intensity conflict, which is the novelty that we are living through. It is fueled by nationalism. It's aimed at restoring a kind of empire, and it's waged by invading another country, by a full-scale invasion. And that is the exact opposite of what the EU stands for. And it's indeed exactly against what the EU was founded originally. The EU has developed as a project of peace and prosperity, based on treaties, on a single market, and on boring meetings. But we have come to value that as well. There is an old phrase, I don't know the author, but it's been repeated sometimes, that the EU is a vegetarian in a world of cannibals. It's not completely true, and we can see with the sanctions against Russia that the vegetarian can have teeth. We can also look at the trade defense instruments that the EU has adopted in the last few years. But ultimately, with Russia being the closest and the most voracious of the cannibals, with China behind, trying to reshape international rules, with both trying together to redefine democracy and the model of society that in the 21st century countries should follow. The question for the EU is whether it can adapt to this situation and whether it can reaffirm its model and its values internally but also in the world. Because, and we can see that in the current crisis, you cannot uphold your values and interests if you are alone. Today we see that Russia has lost Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, but the EU still has to win them, and also the Western Balkans. In a way, Ukraine is a litmus test for the EU, and the questions and the answers that we will try to give today will be an indication of where we stand. So we have on this first panel Katerina Mishchenko, who's writer and editor and who is Ukrainian, which is quite important in our discussion today. We have Nikolai von Ondarza from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, and you lead the EU department, I think. And we have Piotr Buras from Poland, who heads the Warsaw office of the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations. And actually, Piotr will give us introduction to the panel. So, Piotr, I will give you the floor, and if you want to come to the microphone, you're welcome.
Ja, einen schönen Nachmittag, meine Damen und Herren. Vielen Dank für diese Ehre, die mir zukommt, hier sprechen zu dürfen. So we switch into English, no worries about that. I'm very pleased to be here and very delighted, but also very humbled for two reasons. The first one is, of course, the audience and the discussants. Such an eminent audience you don't find very often. But secondly, because I think I'm humbled, because I think it should be actually Katerina who should be standing here in my place. Because I think today it is really more than ever important to listen to our Ukrainian friends if we want to understand why this war is or should be also our war, and why the Ukrainians are fighting and dying not just for their own sovereignty or indeed existence as a society and nation, but also for our security and well-being. So we need really to avoid any navel gazing in our conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to Katarina's contribution, which will certainly help us at that. But all that notwithstanding, also the question about the state of the Union and of the European Union at the times of war is a legitimate one. And I believe that this is a question which is crucial for both the European Union and Ukraine. And most importantly, for our community of faith, which is no longer an aspiration, as I believe, but is a fact, regardless of how the formal process of Ukraine's integration with the EU will proceed. And perhaps this could be some justification for me taking the stage and trying to provide you with some thoughts about that. And no doubt the war in Ukraine is challenging the EU not just economically and politically, but it is far more than that. It is a challenge to the post-heroic culture of our societies, which are today impressed and shocked by, at the same time, by the bravery and suffering of the Ukrainians. It is a challenge to the premises of upon which the EU has been built and thrived, most importantly to the assumption that economic interdependence is the best guarantee of security. And it puts into question the main assumption of the post-war Europe, that a real full-scale war on our continent is not conceivable. In a way, also our world is in tatters, even if it still seems to be quite solid. But seen in a broader context, of the EU's recent history, the war in Ukraine, as much as it is a very unprecedented and dramatic, groundbreaking event, is a part, for me, and an accelerator of a larger transformation of the EU, which has been long in the making. It is a transformation from a project whose rationale at its outset was a response to some intra-European problems, to an entity which is more and more defined by external challenges. The EU was, as we all know, conceived as an idea to prevent war among conflicted European nations. Its aim was to preserve democracy and ensure economic well-being on the continent, to promote reconciliation. It then became a tool to bridge the East and West after the end of the Cold War. But in fact, this idea of advancing economic convergence after 1989, and this idea of bringing two parts of Europe together was yet again part of the same tradition of thinking about Europe as deriving its identity from the past and from Europe's domestic predicaments in the first place. And these were the driving forces of the integration process. And I think, of course, all these fundamentals remain in place, but this picture is, I think, no longer valid as such. In the last decade, at least, the European project has been shaped, and increasingly and more than ever before, by the need to sustain in a more and more complex world in which our key values and our key principles are at risk. And the priorities have been shifting and changing. Climate change, China, COVID-19, geopolitical instabilities in the neighborhood, all these external fundamental challenges had a decisive impact on the EU's agenda over the last years. The European Green Deal, new competition policy, recovery fund, all these major initiatives and projects defining today's EU are all results and symbols of these transformation of these EU's identity. And EU has become kind of less transformative, more defensive, less about convergence, more about geopolitics, often inward-looking, but in fact driven by the need to adapt to the world in which Europe's fundamental assumptions were increasingly proving wrong. And this is, I think, against this background that the implications of the Ukraine war, or Russia war actually, the war in Ukraine, but the Russian war, for the EU need to be analyzed. And once again, the EU is challenged in a fundamental way from outside. And this may prove to become one of the most powerful shocks pushing the EU member states and institutions in a direction which they had until recently not dreamed of. And on the whole, I think the EU has done a strikingly good job. It has managed to maintain its unity on sanctions, with Hungary being an exception perhaps. It has proven to be up to the task when it comes to the support for refugees. It has taken quite groundbreaking decisions on decoupling from Russia when it comes to energy. And even the question of delivering weapons to Ukraine, very controversial and certainly not managed in a way which at least we in Poland, or me personally, would think that it's adequate. But it's certainly not in a story of Europe's defeat, or Europe's not living up to the task. So without falling into a trap of self-complacency, one can say that, yet again, a major crisis seems to be strengthening the EU rather than weakening it. But my point here, which I would like to share with you and discuss with you, is not to repeat this Monet saying about Europe being born in crisis, and saying that this notion is coming true once again our eyes. I think the jury is still out. And more importantly, I would argue that the war in Ukraine has brought to the fore the importance of what I would call EU's unfinished business. What I mean by that? For years, the EU countries have avoided to resolve some fundamental issues in the hope that basically kicking the can down the road would prove to be a safer and better solution than confronting them head on. And the war in Ukraine is more than anything else a painful reminder that a further muddling through could have a very high price for the European Union, perhaps undermining even the positive effects of this EU's accomplishment I was referring to before in facing up to this new fundamental geopolitical challenge. And in reverse, taking this, let's call it Ukrainian lesson seriously, could perhaps become a trigger for a new chapter of EU's history. So what are these unfinished businesses I refer to? I think the first one is clearly the rule of law. The question of how to go about the rule of law and other fundamental values in the European Union. This is quite pathetic to see that while the Ukrainians are fighting for European values, they are fighting not just for the sovereignty, but they are fighting for a democracy based on rule of law. The EU is not able to solve its own fundamental rule of law crisis, because this illusion that the Europeans, all the European countries, would unite around those values in the view of this heroic fight of the Ukrainians has unfortunately come not true during this the last 3 months. We have seen Viktor Orban's success in Hungary. We are yesterday, or the day before yesterday, he imposed a state of emergency in Hungary. We have seen an autocratic leader basically trying to prevent a tough European response to the Russian war. But this is not all what we can refer to. We had also we have a very positive story in my country about how the Poles support Ukrainian refugees. We have a very positive story of the Polish government's engagement for Ukraine. But we have also a consolidation of a system based on not on the European values, not on the rule of law, but in these days, basically, there are decisions being taken which basically contradict the verdicts of the European tribunals. They are undermining, basically, the fundamentals of the European project, and probably will be given a blessing by the European Commission. So we have a fundamental problem which is still unsolved and which is becoming even more fundamental because of what's happening in Ukraine, because I believe that it can, this unresolved problem can backfire also in the case of Ukraine. The unresolved problem of rule of law is the single most important reason why there are considerable doubts about enlarging the European Union. And it's even if some other reasons may be politically even more pertinent and more plausible from the perspective of some political elites, this particular problem is being brought constantly and is very difficult to argue against it. So I think this is one very important unresolved issue at the European level, which we are reminded of once again very painfully by what's happening in Ukraine. The second unfinished business is the enlargement policy itself. The European Union has been at pains for years to avoid any serious discussion about it. And enlargement policy is a synonym for frustration today, not for the hope the Ukrainians deserve and want to have. So we are now discussing the candidate status for Ukraine, and I believe this candidate status needs to be granted. But we also know, we perhaps from think tanks, from those who are following the enlargement policy for years, that it doesn't mean anything. It could be a recipe for failure once again. It could be a recipe for frustration, like it has happened in the case of the Western Balkans. And this in a situation where Europe is facing a completely changed geopolitical landscape, where Russia's aggression against Ukraine basically creates a completely different Europe. There is no European security order anymore. We shouldn't hope that we could establish one anytime soon. We need to brace ourselves for a new European security disorder, a situation in which this confrontation with Russia and hostility to Russia basically prevails and is with us for a longer period of time. And in that situation, Europe needs to make a choice. Needs to make, I would say, something much more than granting candidate status for Ukraine, but needs to make sure that the countries, like associated countries in the eastern neighborhood, like the countries in the Western Balkans, that they are firmly anchored in the European project, which of course does not equal enlargement yet. But this perspective of enlargement is today even more important than it was before. And so Ukraine is basically, with its application for the EU membership, is forcing the EU to quickly rethink and answer the most inconvenient question the EU could receive about its borders, about its geopolitical ambitions, and in fact about its identity. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is, it has already been mentioned by Eric, the question of solidarity in the European Union and our resilience, because the Russian war against Ukraine will of course lead to a number of asymmetric shocks in Europe. So various countries will be hit by the consequences of the sanctions policy, of rising energy prices in various ways. And the question is how to go about it. How should we as Europeans deal with the asymmetric shocks, with these differences across Europe? Can we really allow the countries to deal with these problems individually? basically using their national instruments, national resources. Is it wise to have only very limited common spending in Europe on defense or energy policy? What could we do to help Ukraine reconstruct its economy after this war, and how should we cope together with a possible, sadly, new wave of refugees from Ukraine? So if we do not address these issues together, sharing the burden and finding new instruments to cope with them, I think that it could be to the detriment of the European project. So these are all extremely fundamental three issues which are still unresolved in Europe, and I think there is still too little courage and too little thinking about them. And the main lesson from the Ukrainian fight against the Russian aggression is that our fates are interconnected. It cannot be disentangled anymore. And the war is forcing the EU, as I try to show, to revisit its long overdue assumptions, and may, in the end, even strengthen it. But a strong Europe requires a strong Ukraine and vice versa. So I would argue that for that reason, the main raison d'etat of the European Union today is to help Ukrainians to win this war. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. So I will turn first to Katerina, because of course we are speaking a lot about your country, and your country, which for many years was mainly seen probably as a former Soviet state, and then as a country which was between two areas, and now a country which is part of the European family, that has been officially said by EU leaders, even if we are still waiting for the consequence of what it means being in the European family. The question of the accession to the EU is raised, and it will be discussed next month at the European Summit. So I want to ask you personally where you stand, but how do you see your country in this moving geopolitical landscape, and your country being now considered and accepted as part of the European family? Is it progress despite the circumstances, or is it something that you still feel is not sufficient enough? And what would you expect in the future, given the current situation?
I think there are different aspects. Maybe I could start with a short story. Last week, I met a friend of mine who came from Kiev to Berlin. I organized a public discussion on culture and war in Ukraine, and she was there. And we were in exchange about COVID, about pandemics, these masks regulations, etc. And she told, yeah, it's quite strange that it's still discussed here where to wear masks, where not, because in Ukraine, in the first week, COVID just disappeared from the agenda. We get some updates for our Minister of Health, how it's going. It's going quite good, at least with COVID. And and I told her then, you know, I feel that we are ambassadors of the dark future here, without pandemics, but with this fresh war experience. And then I thought, is it future or is it past, or what kind of temporality is it? But I am afraid that it is still future. It's not past. And this is maybe one aspect about where Ukraine is now. So it's like the highest point of crisis of everything is very, very bad, and we can see it in Ukraine today. And the other thing, I think there is still this border, and this border should be protected by the EU in order not to get closer to war. That's why I think there are so many regulations and discussions about weapons given to Ukraine in order not to escalate, not to risk that some other country would be attacked. So it's still something repressed, this repressed problematic relationship with Russia. And Ukraine is somehow now this space of repression. I found it interesting that Andrzej Duda discussed with Vladimir Zelensky this other border politics. I thought it's really symbolic because Polish people are today also very afraid of the attack. And some of the missiles are going really close to the border. It means that the border disappears slowly. But at the same time, I think it's quite good, protected still. And what is... Yeah, I forgot your question. Where is Ukraine now? And this...
It's a big question.
Yeah, and this story with the membership, somehow, for today's Ukrainian experience, I think it feels supportive, but it came too late. And somehow I also feel sorry about this European dream, because now we have to deal with this fulfilling of this dream or some promise of fulfilling, but in such a dramatic situation, and I ask myself, should we see it as a prize for entering? So I think it's also a very difficult ethical challenge to reflect on it today. And should we be happy or should we be angry that it comes only now? So I think it's quite open question still.
Does it change the way you look at the EU? Does it change the way Ukrainians look at the EU? This reluctance to speak about accession and the debates we have on the delivery of weapons, for instance, and the support.
Yeah, I think I see it now as a tool for resistance, to win this war. Just a quick integration, or at least a statement about integration, about this willingness to integrate Ukraine. I think it will be a strong argument in this war if we don't consider only military dimension of it. Yeah, but what Ukrainians think, it's difficult to say. I think there is really an active project of future which is elaborated today, and I think it is a big support for people and inspiration to fight. But there is also so much bitterness in this debate, I think. Especially some signals from Netherlands, from Germany as well, from France, that it's not so easy, maybe in 10 years, and it doesn't feel really inspiring in today's situation.
You think it's a way of saying we don't want you, or you understand?
Yeah, I translated, okay, now you have this war, we should support you somehow. Maybe it's really something about values. Okay, we will think about you. Something like that. I think it's still not considered as something terrible happened with us. Something terrible happened with our neighbors, with nice Ukrainians who made this revolution 8 years ago, who live in the war since last 8 years. Yeah, and we should do something good for them. I think we are still a bit others.
And do you think this could change when Ukraine wins this war? because that's what we all hope.
Yeah, we all hope, but I'm not sure that all hope. I'm not sure that European politics, I mean official politics, that they really hope. I think they are afraid of this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean, hope? They can contribute to this, winning of the war, and they are still careful. They are still afraid that Ukraine can win, and that's why I think it's also it's not only about Russia and about nuclear disaster, but it's also about the future, about these efforts to imagine some new future, to be more open, to be bigger. And all this anxiousness is now somehow also projected on Ukraine and on this situation.
Nikolai, when you look at the diagnosis made by Piotr about where the EU is now, the unfinished business, and what should be done, or what we should try to do, and when you look on the other side at the expectations and the hope to join the EU, that looks like a circle to square. So, what advice would you give, or how do you look at this situation yourself?
First of all, thank you also for inviting me. For me, I think it's a very, very delicate balance to give the right answer to Ukraine on the question for membership. I can understand that it feels like rejection when people from the Netherlands or France or Germany say this is something that will take 10 years. But playing a little bit the devil's advocate, I think it is the honest answer. If we look at the EU as a bureaucratic organization with the single market, with all its rules, everyone which has studied enlargement and accession process knows that this is a very long and very detailed process. And it sometimes feels a strange picture. The Commission President von der Leyen flies into Kiev, a war zone, and the present that she brings with her is a questionnaire. It's a questionnaire for becoming EU candidate status. And for the EU point of view, it's a big step. It's something that the EU has ruled out for many, many years, and now is contemplating that step. And I think what the EU needs to offer Ukraine is something in between the status now and what's going to be a long road towards membership. And there we enter a very, very difficult discussion. Macron put on this idea of this European political community, something in between full EU membership and the association status that Ukraine has at the moment. And a colleague of mine said from the German government, said we need to be careful that everything that has only the sniff of being second-tier membership will instantly be rejected. And I think it needs to be clear that this is a transitionary phase, that the EU should offer Ukraine more on the way to becoming a full member. But I also think we need to be honest that neither the EU nor Ukraine will be ready for full membership in the immediate future. And a lot of things have happened in the last 3 months, which were thought to be unlikely that the EU would be able to do, and Piotr named a couple of them. But I still feel that full membership of the EU, it's more than just becoming a member of a club. There are so many rules and so much integration that needs to happen that I feel we need a process towards membership, a process towards membership that is more credible than what the EU has signaled towards the Western Balkans, where I think it has disappointed many countries, but a process where it's also clear this is going to take years. And it's going to be part of the reconstruction of Ukraine, hopefully after Ukraine wins the war, but a longer process and not an immediate step. And I also think we need to be honest with ourselves that granting the candidate status is just the first step of that road, and that then the road to accession needs to be more, let's say, political, with more significant steps of integration rather than just waiting to the full step in sometime 10 years or so when Ukraine becomes a full member. The second point I wanted to make on Piotr's introduction is that I've actually been a little bit more positively surprised by the EU. I can't imagine in now almost 20 years of studying the EU any of the crises that you named beforehand in the introduction, the refugee crisis, the Eurozone crisis, even COVID. I can't think of a single one where the EU was so united for most of the time. There are, of course, difficulties, as you rightfully put out, with Orban's Hungary most importantly, but I feel that the reaction of the EU has been swiftly and strongly united on many fronts. There's always more that the EU and its country could do in terms of delivering weapons and stronger sanctions on oil, but I think overall this has been the foreign policy crisis where the EU has been most able to speak with a single word, with a single voice, and been able to coordinate quite successfully with its allies in the United States, but also now the United Kingdom. So overall, if you've asked me on the 25th of February, would we be standing here in May with so many sanctions on Russia, Ukraine having been so successful in repelling parts of the Russian attacks, I would not have believed that to be possible. And I think this is an achievement, most of all of the Ukrainians, but I think to some extent also of the EU that we should acknowledge.
But, well, what you say about Ukraine enlargement is like redefining the whole enlargement process, which is huge, because it's not only for Ukraine, it's for the Western Balkans countries. And this idea of political community is also redefining how the EU works in a way. Well, maybe it will be for later in this discussion, but the question of changing the treaties and so on. So it's already a big thing to open, while there are the rule of law, which is important and which could prevent from doing these kind of reforms and conducting this project. So what kind of priorities should we have? Can we try to achieve both at the same time, finishing the business and opening the new works of enlargement or the neighborhood policies and something that can bring Ukraine closer to Europe, to the EU, without preventing from, doing the daily job of the EU?
I think the answer needs to be both. I mean, there's long time been the discussion in the early 2000s when I studied on EU affairs between deepening and widening, so Erweiterung und Vertiefung of the EU, and that's been mostly used to stop either one of them. The opponents of deepening said we first have to do enlargement, and the opponents of enlargement said we first have to do deepening to prepare the EU for the enlargement. And I think the last 10 years or so, the EU really declared enlargement basically dead. So Juncker said there will be no enlargement during my time as Commission President. Von der Leyen was a little bit more careful, but her commissioner is named for neighborhood policy and enlargement negotiations. So not enlargement, just negotiations. And there was a pretty clear consensus that it will not happen in the foreseeable future. And that really has changed in the last 3 months. I think we're having now a serious conversation about enlargement again. And of course, these ideas, whether you call them European political community or some sort of family action plan or integration step by step, I think we need to think big, and we need to combine these two issues. If we only talk about one or two of them or play them against each other, we play into the hands of those who want to stop them. We have to think them together, what needs to be done to reform the EU for an EU of 30 plus members, and what needs to be done to reform the accession process to make it more politically, more credible again, and also offers a step to bring these countries step by step into a European framework to also make them ready for the European Union. And finally, it also needs to be credible to the whole group of countries. Ukraine is a special case now, and probably nothing about Ukraine accession into the EU will be like the previous accession processes. But I think we cannot forget the countries of the Western Balkans, where we also need to give them a more credible answer about their European future. And so I think we need to tackle these two together rather than play them off each other and therefore block both deepening and widening again.
Yeah. I realize we tried to start with the human dimension of the crisis, and 15 minutes later we end up with the institutional reform, which is probably part of the problem. Piotr, you wanted to add something?
I just one comment, because I think what we need at the moment in the European Union is in the reaction to this war in Ukraine is a recommitment to enlargement. I mean, we need to politically recommit to this very important project of the European Union, because we have kind of forgotten that enlargement policy has been the most effective, the most successful, most transformative policy of the European Union. And I think it is a success story. It is the most important success story of the European project. This is enlargement policy. It's, of course, single market is key, but without enlarging the European Union, we wouldn't be there where we are. And we are now at a moment of a fundamental geopolitical challenge, fundamental geopolitical change in Europe, which I tried to briefly to explain, where basically we cannot accept long term. We cannot accept a geopolitical void in the proximity of the European Union. We cannot accept a geopolitical void in the Balkans, and we cannot accept that the countries, especially Ukraine, but also Moldova, also Georgia, that they kind of feel unsafe again. And I think what the European Union can provide today is what I'm calling a recommitment to the enlargement policy. So we are talking about various, technocratic terms or ideas which are floating around now. With each government has almost an idea how to call the new framework for a non-enlarging European Union. But I think what we need is a kind of a partnership for enlargement. I mean, partnership for enlargement. Of course, I fully agree with Nikolai that we know that Ukraine will not become member of the European Union within the next decade. And the Ukrainians know it very well. But if we do not grant them today the candidate status, and if we do not come up with a new offer to all countries in the neighborhood, not only Ukraine. I think this is also true for Moldova, this is true for the Western Balkans, to Georgia. When we do not define our, also I would call it a geopolitical ambition. So basically we want those countries to be part of us, full stop. We want them to be part of the European Union. We don't know when, but we will do everything what it takes that they join the European Union, and that we design our policies, that we design the reconstruction fund for Ukraine, for example, in the post-war time, which will be, of course, will have to happen, so that Ukraine is being prepared to join the European Union at a certain moment in future. But if we do not do it now, our commitment to enlargement is no longer credible. This is the moment for us to say, we envisage a wider Europe, a wider European Union. We don't know what the European Union institutionally will look like in let's say, 2030. But we want to have those countries inside because this is in our geopolitical interest as the European Union. We know what can happen if there is a void which can be filled by China or Russia, and so this is really, I'm sorry to say that, it's not only about the Ukrainians. I mean, it is important for Ukraine, but it's not less important for us current members of the European Union.
So if we give in June the candidate status, of course we know it will be a long process. What should be done in between? What should be the priorities economically? Or you mentioned the reconstruction, of course, which is obvious and which will maybe we'll have to wait for the situation to allow for reconstruction. So we have millions of refugees in Europe already, in the EU. People who, we were discussing that just before, who can go back to Ukraine and back to the EU, not staying in the EU, but trying to stay between the two countries. So politically, economically, or humanly, what can be done after the status is given? I will ask Katerina first, and then I'll get back to you. What would you expect if there is a candidate status in June? Mm-hmm. What do you think would be useful for Ukraine, and what do you think Ukraine could bring to the EU in the short term before we go into this long process of the accession?
I think the first of all, the goal is that Ukraine does not become the ghost member of the EU. Mm-hmm. So somehow we should stop the war and support Ukraine on different levels. Because now I read it just recently in the train that despite of all these hard sanctions against Russia, Ukrainian economy is much more destroyed today than the Russian. And something should be done now. There are some steps, I know, with this import things.
Yeah, the facilities on imports, less taxes on Ukrainian imports.
And I think this is important. The second is reconstruction and all these things which are not connected with the war itself. But, you know, it's really a strange situation for me. I would be happy to discuss this future project of Europe, because it was always something very interesting for me to discover, to think together, etc. But I'm sorry, the war is still there, and we cannot, and the EU, I think, with all, I understand that it's hard, but you cannot avoid it. You cannot just wait that somehow it will be solved and then we can help, reconstruct, integrate and build the future. Now we should fight for this future, also for the possibility to think about enlargement of Europe, about existence of Europe, at least in the form which we have today. And I think the danger is quite big for many countries, not only for Ukraine. And I think here we have also a point connected with the future, and we spoke about bureaucracy, about human dimension. What is also very important are ideas. Which idea will will be some kind of driver of all these reforms, enlargement, new projects. And I think it is idea from the last century, the anti-fascist idea, which came after the war and when European Union actually appeared. Yes, it was about economy, but I think this anti-fascist impulse was present. Maybe it was not so articulated also in recent years, I don't know. Also after the beginning of war in Donbass and annexation of Crimea, yeah, because such a dimension of war was not thinkable. But today I think we should think about it and about the new recipe against fascism in Europe, in the world, because it didn't happen just end of February. We know that Putin financed so many right-wing parties, organizations, initiatives all around also the world, not only Europe. So, and somehow now we have this huge right-wing, I don't know how to say, challenge, and or just the most cruel, how to say, representation of it in Europe. So you cannot just deal with it with some peaceful thinking about the future, because this is a very painful situation, but we all have to fight this fascist regime. And it will be, I think, really difficult as much as it was difficult in the last century. And I should also remind you that that time, that Lend-Lease weapons, all the weapons delivered to Soviet Union, they were just not, you cannot just compare it with the weapons which are delivered today. It's much, much more or less. And that's why I think we should really reconsider this anti-fascist idea, which maybe is not so nice for Europe because we are all against fascism, but what does it mean to be really against it and to be really challenged by it and to be forced also to use violence to fight it? I think it's a huge challenge, but I don't see any option today how you can avoid it.
I will, if you want follow up to what you were saying about accession, or what should be done in between.
You ask an important question, of course, what should be offered to Ukraine or to other countries in Europe's neighborhood in this transition period. But I think that there are numbers of options, but I think they are probably not so interesting for this discussion here, and perhaps not so relevant, as Katarina rightly pointed out, in the immediate future. What is absolutely crucial for the next months, but also years, even if there is a kind of, I don't know how to even call it, not a peace settlement, certainly not. There won't be any peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Maybe ceasefire, maybe the cessation of military activities. But we need to accept and kind of take into account that we are in for a permanent, basically, confrontation with a hostile Russia. And I think this should be the starting point. And even when we think about Ukraine, or especially when we think about Ukraine, what we should do for Ukraine, or what should we do about Ukraine. The main thing we should do about Ukraine in the nearest future is to support Ukraine militarily, not during the war, after the war. Because, and I know this is a very unpleasant truth, especially to talk about in Germany. But if we assume, I mean just rationally, if we assume there won't be any peace, don't believe in a peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia anytime soon. So what then? What can we do about it? How can we envisage the next 2-3 years? And Andriy Yermak, the advisor to President Zelensky, had an interesting speech, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, in Davos. And he spoke about the security guarantees for Ukraine after the war. Because this is the main expectation. And he said basically, of course we know that we won't have any security guarantees from you, because you won't fight. we will not join NATO. You will not give us any security guarantees, and even if you do, they won't be worth anything. And he's very right. Like the Budapest Memorandum, which was, basically a piece of paper. So the only thing which makes sense for Ukraine, but also for us, is to give a promise to Ukraine that we will support this country and with heavy weapons as long as it's needed, and pay for that, and do that, and send these weapons, so that Ukraine can defend itself and can deter Russia on its own, not without help, because we are not, Russia knows that we will not step in. And I think this is, it's a very, I think, difficult to perhaps to accept for many, but I really do not see any other option for a sustainable solution when it comes to the security in Europe in the upcoming years, because the alternative is yet another war. And it will come. If Ukraine is not strong enough, Russia will invade it again, even if there is a sort of peace settlement or anything resembling that.
Nikolai, you raised your finger.
So hard to follow up on that. I firstly completely agree with Piotr that the biggest, most important help that the EU can give is in defense against Russia. And I think it's almost weird to have this conversation now about accession as if the war against Russia was already won, which is, as far as I can tell, far from over, even if Ukraine has been more successful than we expected. And if we look at the countries giving military aid to Ukraine, the number one hasn't been named today, which is the United States, which has by far given much more military aid than any European country. And I think that should put pressure on the EU countries collectively, but also individually, to give much more security help for Ukraine. So if we talk about any kind of sort of pathway to EU membership, it needs to include a security component with additional help from the EU, but also from the other country. Then just the second point I would put in, as you said, Katharina, the economic help. I think it's very, very hard at this moment to put a number on the amount of money needed for Ukraine to reconstruct during the war, but also after the war. And the EU as an economic organization, this is the field where it has the expertise. But it's also been reluctant to use that expertise. If we look at the Western Balkans, a colleague of mine recently calculated that if you look at the difference between Croatia as an EU member and countries like North Macedonia, Croatia gets about 10 times as much money from EU funds than Northern Macedonia gets. So if there is to be a credible path to EU membership that comes with a reconstruction offer, it needs to be much, much more than the EU is currently willing to employ in its accession process. Not just, as you said, an investment in Ukraine, but also in our common interest for a common European future. And then thirdly, and this is where maybe my European technocratic hat comes into, how can we organize such a process that it's not just going to what it's now 35 chapters and the EU Commission goes to Kiev and has bureaucratic conversation with its Ukrainian counterparts. Is this idea of having sectorial integration, so having steps on integration that are significant that would help Ukraine in reconstruction. So, for instance, recently Ukraine was connected to the European electricity grid rather than the electricity grid of Russia. And there are many of these areas where Ukraine could be integrated into parts of the European single market to give it support not only in terms of money but access to the European market. And I think this is something concretely that could be done where you don't have, like, there is a story from Kafka, I think, where he describes climbing stairs. And if you have many small stairs, you can go quite quickly up to a very, very high point. But if you have only one huge stair and you stand between it, you don't believe that you will ever make it to the top. And I think what we need to do is have these small steps where it's candidate status and then sectorial integration in this area and this area, which is a more credible pathway than this one huge step where you stand before and you never believe that you're going to make that step because it seems so distant and so high. And I think this could be a way for both Ukraine but also the Western Balkans.
I did not mention at the start of this discussion that, of course, there will be questions from the audience to the panelists. Before I do that, I would like just to ask you to come back to the question of solidarity. What is now and what could be in the future the main point of solidarity? Because there was no solidarity between the EU member states with the migration crisis in 2015, and now we see that, of course, there is no discussion of sending Ukrainians from one country to the other, but there is some kind of solidarity between Europeans and Ukrainians, and we don't see many tensions as before. Solidarity, we had it with the pandemic. Could it be replicated? Can we have the same kind of solidarity with the war and the economic consequences? How do you see that quickly before we go to the audience? Piotr again.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the migration issue, I think this has been an immense progress on that in the European Union. It's comparing these two refugee crises, 2015 and 2022. There is a major difference. We have now the so-called Temporary Protection Directive in place, which allows all Ukrainian refugees to basically move freely across Europe and enjoy protection in each EU member state. So they do not need to be asylum seekers. They are not claiming, the asylum status. This extremely painful process is off the table, which is, I think, a major improvement and a major step forward. But of course, when you talk about solidarity, I think coming from Poland, we have a very particular situation in Poland. We have, of course, we accepted most, by far the highest number of refugees from Ukraine this year, and we have 1.5 million refugees in Poland now. But the Polish government is not very much interested in a new solidarity scheme, for example, a relocation on voluntary basis or anything like that, because it would set a precedent. So it would mean that perhaps at some point in time, in future, the South European countries, if they are facing problems with refugees.
You mean the government shows that we can have a refugee crisis without an EU scheme and relocation?
So this is a very particular situation, that basically there is a country which would be eligible for more solidarity, doesn't want it, because it wants to show that we can cope with that on our own. And in fact, so far it has worked. And I think we were almost at the point of collapse, almost, but in that time, kind of this wave receded, and the situation became manageable again. I don't want to think about a scenario first of all, for completely different reasons, but I also looking at Poland, that we have a new wave of refugees. I think we wouldn't be able to cope with that. And then the solidarity question returns to us, and so I think this is still not over when it comes also to the European discussion. But what could be done is I think a relocation scheme on voluntary basis. So basically that there are many countries, many communities in Europe, also in Western Europe, which are ready to help, but it needs to be organized. It cannot be like a spontaneous movement because it doesn't work. And then it needs to be a common European fund to do that. And we need to be prepared for such a scenario, I think. I know that, and Katarina can tell a lot, certainly about that it's not so easy also for in this case, for Ukrainians to move to other country where they do not speak language. This is not the most, appealing option for them. But, if there is a choice between, I don't want to paint gloomy scenarios here, but if there is a choice between being in a street or in a huge refugee reception center, and in a safe place in a different country, probably this option should be available, and should be available very quickly. And I think we are not prepared for that at the moment. So this solidarity mechanism is still not there, and there is very little thinking about it.
And Nikolai, maybe about the economic solidarity.
Yes,
because
I was thinking.
We know that in Germany it will probably be a debate soon about European plan to share the cost or to support some member states.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There are many different ways of showing solidarity, and I think the Russian war against Ukraine has thrown up so many challenges that there are many areas for solidarity. I think an area where the EU already has shown solidarity between itself is energy. So Poland, Bulgaria, now Finland have been cut off from Russian gas, where other EU member states have stepped in and provided access to gas and other forms of energy. And if we get into the further situation of an embargo on oil, maybe possibly Russian retaliation on the gas market, there will be need for much, much more solidarity between the EU member states. And there is this idea of common purchasing of gas. So in order not to outbid each other, but try to get joint access to gas on the international market. And then there is the whole question of inflation, rising prices, and the economic answer to that, which of course is a European challenge, which, as Piotr said in the beginning, is asymmetric, so countries will be affected differently. And there is a huge question of now the EU first has announced that they will going to take the flexibility on national spending will continue for the next 2 years to give governments more fiscal space to react to that. But there will eventually be the question of more EU money in support of EU member states. And here, I think we'll run into the tricky question of rule of law again, because as we know, the recovery fund, so the fund that was set up for the spending against the COVID crisis, has not been given for Poland and for Hungary, two of the countries most affected by the secondary effects of the Russian war against Ukraine. And a new fund, if it would be set up, which will certainly be a question that will be very controversially discussed in Germany and the German government in particular, I think a new fund can only happen with the rule of law mechanism as a condition for giving out that money. So there will immediately be the question under which condition could support and solidarity be shown to Poland, which has done so much for Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time is not bending much on the question of rule of law in the country. Hungary even worse, which is demanding a lot of money for European solidarity if it were ever to support an oil embargo. And so these questions are deeply intertwined and there's no easy answer. And I think for now, the EU should stay hard on not giving the money of the recovery fund to Poland and Hungary, but there might come a time where we will need to make a decision between a big push on intra-European solidarity and maybe turning a blind eye on the rule of law towards Poland at least, and possibly even Hungary, if we want sanctions on oil against Russia in order to get a Hungarian support. So it's very tough here that we might run into problems on the European level on solidarity very soon.
Are there any questions before we go to the audience? When we say EU solidarity, what does it mean for you? Not EU citizen, but looking at and living here.
I think somehow that this situation with Ukrainian refugees, there are two aspects, I think. On one hand, it's really a possibility to rethink the politics connected with refugees in general. Yeah, and it was discussed and compared how the people, for example, from Syria were treated, when was it? 2015, and now, etc. It's one aspect, but for Ukraine, I think it's more this politics. So my feeling is it's kind of excuse not to fight with Ukrainians, but at least to take care of people who managed to leave the country. But I ask myself the whole time what happens with the people who stayed and with the people who don't want to leave. And is it now their problem that they leave, or the problem of people who fight? Okay, you wanna fight, but we will take care of the people who will survive, possibly, yeah, who will leave. So, on one hand, yes, I think for Ukrainians it's a huge support and it's really important. But I stay mentally somehow in Ukraine and look at people who are there. And I think they also need solidarity, the real solidarity. And also interesting in today's situation is the division between society or different communities and official politics. And now we see
in Ukraine or
no, I mean also here. Yeah, it's not by occasion that Zelensky always uses this direct communication with the people who go to the squares and who are standing on the squares, because he understands very good that his direct communication is a guarantee that there will be some discussion, some pressure, and then he can influence the politics somehow. And at the same time, I think it's a possibility or a chance to rethink democracy and for empowerment also for many people in Europe. And it's a good protection from right-wing populism if the people feel that they are present, that they are also politically important. So I think here we can see another aspect of solidarity, which is not only about Ukraine, but about European political imagination.
European looking more at Ukrainians than Ukrainians looking at Europeans, in a way.
Yes.
Can we take questions from the audience? I think we can take questions in auf Deutsch as well. In German and English, as you want. Yes.
That was extremely interesting and in many ways very moving. As you may guess, I didn't vote for Brexit, but I'm ending up having to speak for it. And I wonder if this question has really been posed in the right way. Because we're now witnessing the collapse of the post-war architecture, or possibly the collapse of the post-war architecture, it's not about the EU, but about the post-war architecture. So, what do we have to look at? Not the EU, but the Council of Europe. That's the Europe of 47. We've already got it. We don't have to reinvent it. It wasn't the EU which was transformative in introducing the rule of law. It was the Council of Europe which did it as a precondition for admission to the EU. Then we've got the catastrophic condition of the United Nations. That's the nettle we really have to grasp. The UN and the Security Council, which have failed Ukraine so drastically. America has supported, but the UN and the Security Council have failed us. Finally, so we're talking about reconstructing post-war architecture post-Ukraine. And then the last thing I'd mention is the International Criminal Court, which again is looking to fail Ukraine, and other mechanisms are going to have to be sought going back to Nuremberg. So we're going back to 1945, 1947, instead of 2004 or 2008. Something's wrong there too. I don't think any one person can do this, but I'm talking about a wholesale reconstruction of which EU should be a part and cannot possibly be the sole mover.
I would encourage all of us to start thinking slightly different categories, to start thinking not in categories of new architecture, new settlement, new order, but rather to at least to make this intellectual exercise of imagining a disorder, something where there are no common rules. There are no new rules. They are basically we need to withstand it, and we need to kind of find our place in a new disorder. And I think this is the reality which we will face for some time, because I don't see basically the major powers, especially Russia, which is of such an importance for us in Europe, clearly, agreeing on any set of common rules. And I think it would be even a very dangerous illusion to think that this is possible. And striving toward this end, or for this end, could lead us completely astray. And I think, so we need to, that's why of course you may think that this is an extremely Polish view or East European, but, perhaps listening to some East European views in the past may have spared us some problems today. So I think it would be advisable to think about how a new European security disorder could look like, and what we need to do in such a framework to ensure our security and our well-being.
Another question?
Thank you. I think some of those questions will actually be addressed directly at the second panel today, which is about Europe's place in a new global constellation in the new world. Katja, we've known each other since 2013, when we met at a conference in Oslo. And when we were there, the first outbursts of really nasty violence happened at the Maidan. And I've known you since then, and I always knew you as an ardent defender of the European project, of the European perspective of Ukraine. And you fought for that on the Maidan, but also after that. So I have and now today, you sound completely disillusioned about the aims and the capability of Europe. When did this happen? Did it happen with the annexation of Crimea, 2014? Or somewhere on the way from there? Did it happen on the 24th of February at 4:30 in the morning? Or did it happen after that, as of this year? Where did we go so wrong to lose you?
It's a very good question. Surprisingly, it didn't happen during the annexation of Crimea. Maybe a little bit, but not really. I think it happened as I learned about Frontex activities, about financing of it, and about people who are sued for rescuing refugees in the sea. I read some posts on Facebook from an NGO Sea-Watch, which was like a self-organization to rescue people. And I think the situation of people in Afghanistan was the point where I was sure it will happen with us and we will be alone. I think Putin shared this idea as well and felt really inspired by the situation in Afghanistan and how just nobody did anything in the situation. Yeah, I think this situation of refugees from different countries, it was somehow I couldn't just bring it together with the rhetorics of values, of democracy, about this narcissistic statement, yes, we are people with these values, and now, and on the other hand, a mayor of some Italian small city who managed to integrate refugees is a criminal. How does it work together? It was, yeah, it was a question for me. That's why I didn't have so many illusions. Actually, I'm surprised that there is more solidarity than I thought. Maybe it's really because Ukraine surprised even itself with this will to fight and not to give up in this war.
Someone, yes, first row. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question to Nikolai. I agree basically with many things you said, especially on weapons and deliveries. My question is, when you tell us about enlargement and accession of Ukraine to the European Union and giving Ukraine the membership status, either it might be your position or you're just telling us what you hear from politicians. I wonder if you are aware that we are talking about signals, and what you told us about the steps and the small steps and the big step. The question is, do we say Ukraine, yes, if you do all these small steps in the next 10, 15 or 20 years, in the end, you're entitled to become a member? Or do we frame the story right now that allegedly Ukraine wants to access the European Union in 5 months, which is not true. Everybody knows that it's not about accession, but about telling them, yes, in 10 or 15 years after all these steps, you are entitled. You are a member of the family right now, but you have to do your job. And the framing of the German government and the framing of the European Union and French government, and you repeated this, is it's impossible for tactical reasons to enter right now. And that's not true, but because this is not what Ukraine wants. So are you aware of the signal you or the governments are sending? This is my question.
I think it's a very, very hard debate because things get misinterpreted quite easily. I remember on the day von der Leyen said that she can imagine Ukraine becoming a member eventually of the European Union, and then the European Parliament had that vote where they voted in favor of potentially of Ukraine potentially becoming an EU member. That was, at least in the public discussion, directly represented as European Parliament calls for a fast-track procedure for EU membership, and von der Leyen is open for a quick accession of Ukraine to the European Union. And I think this is the very delicate balance. I think it's right to give Ukraine the signal that it can eventually become a member of the European Union. It's right to say, and I'm in favor of granting the Ukraine candidate status in June, but I think it should also be a question of expectation management, because it can very easily turn around into that the EU creates expectations that it will not be able to fulfill. And that can easily backlash into disappointing Ukraine, or even turning the complete other way around. We recently had a conference with colleagues from the Western Balkans, and they were absolutely furious. They were absolutely furious whenever we discussed about accession, specifically a colleague from Northern Macedonia who was involved in the negotiation with Greece, who said they felt they had sacrificed everything, and the EU had dangled before them the promise of membership, or at least the candidate status. And quickly afterwards, another veto player came around and said, no, we cannot do it at the moment. You have to sacrifice the next piece. And this is a very dangerous road to come on. And therefore, I'm not speaking for any government. I'm speaking for myself. I think it needs to be a balance of the EU saying, we will give you candidate status. Ukraine is part of the European family, but this is a longer road. And this is why I think we need the step in between, not because I think we should say, Ukraine, you have to first jump over this step and jump over this step, but rather the other way around. For us, EU saying, we are willing to integrate you in this area and connect you to this area, and maybe invite you to this institution, at least as an observer or with speaking right, and to start the process of integration and make it something real and credible, rather than the example of North Macedonia, where you first expect them to give up a huge part of their national identity and then say, sorry, there's another one of us who has a veto, who doesn't want you to become a member of the European Union. We cannot give it to you right now. And I think this would be the most dangerous outcome. And we should just remind ourselves there was a whole referendum in the Netherlands, not against Ukraine membership of the EU, but against an association agreement that was successfully against that association agreement. The government found a way around, but there is certainly a sentiment in still parts of European countries that would react very critical to Ukraine becoming a member. And so I think it's more honest at this moment to say this is going to be a longer process than it is to say candidate status now, which created, at least in some media, the impression that there is a fast-track procedure, which I don't see the EU applying either for Ukraine or for any of the other candidate countries.
Thank you very much. And we'll have a break and then the second panel.